Good evening, everyone. I'm Suzanne Pincus, member of ADL's Global Advisory Council and board chair for the Connecticut region. Thank you for joining us tonight. First, I hope you are all healthy and safe, and I want to acknowledge what a difficult time we're living in. People have been sick, have died, have lost loved ones, people have lost their livelihoods, and many are struggling. Added to this is the disparate impact of the pandemic on communities of color, both in terms of health and economically. And on top of this were the murders of 3 Black people, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then George Floyd, adding new names to a list that is already far too long. Justice, justice shall you pursue. The title of our program is taken from the Torah, from Parshat Shoftim, and we use it in recognition that justice is an eternal obligation, central to what it means to be a Jew. It is also central to the mission of ADL, which is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. As David Waren has written, the scourge of racism stands in radical opposition to our Jewish values. So tonight, in conversation with Shawn Wooden, Treasurer for the state of Connecticut, Steve Ginsburg, the Regional Director of ADL Connecticut, and David Waren, the President and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford, we are going to learn about racism and inequality and what we can do to stop it. This conversation came about because Treasurer Wooden wrote an op-ed piece in the Hartford Courant in which he discussed some personal experiences with racism and offered a way for corporate America to be part of the solution. He also mentioned his 2 sons. One of those young men is a friend and teammate of my son. He lives in my neighborhood, and the thought of anything bad happening to him, simply because of the color of his skin, makes my heart hurt. It reminds me of something Representative Johanna Hayes recently wrote, that fighting racism requires us to see value in other people's children. So I reached out to Treasurer Wooden, and he graciously agreed to help us continue the conversation. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Prior to taking office in 2018, Treasurer Wooden spent 21 years as an investment attorney focused on public pension plans. Born and raised in Hartford, Treasurer Wooden graduated from Trinity College and worked in key roles for the Mayor of Hartford and the State Commissioner of Social Services. He also served as president of the Hartford City Council and as the Connecticut State Director of Project Vote. Treasurer Wooden holds a JD from the NYU School of Law and worked in the AFL-CIO's office in Washington, D.C., the Office of Investment. One note before we start, the panelists will be responding to questions. You can submit them in the Q&A function, which can be opened by clicking the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. It's the one that's near the Leave button. Please include your name and the town that you're from, and they'll do their best to answer all the questions, but might not get to everyone. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to ADL Connecticut Director Steve Ginsburg, Hartford Federation President David Waren, and Connecticut State Treasurer Shawn Wooden. Thank you.
Thank you. And first, Suzanne, I want to thank you for reaching out, and I want to thank the Jewish Federation and the ADL for hosting this event this evening. It is both, my title is State Treasurer, but obviously this is a very personal issue to me in terms of what we're witnessing in our country today and what I and many in the African-American community have experienced over a long, long period of time. And so I welcome this conversation, and I thank everyone who signed up and who's viewing this right now. I actually feel, just like Suzanne is a friend, I feel like I'm speaking and we're having a conversation with a group of friends and allies. And I am acutely aware of our kinship as communities over a long period of time. We have a shared understanding of what oppression means. We have a shared understanding of what ugliness looks like. And we also have a shared understanding of perseverance and hope and faith. And that's what this conversation ultimately is about. And just to you heard a bit of my background. So I was raised in the north end of Hartford. I was the youngest of 6 kids. And my parents, I wrote a little bit in my op-ed about us going south to Georgia, where they were from. But one of the things my father always told me about coming north. It was, basically his version of the American dream in terms of pursuing something better for our family. And we came north for three reasons. One was for economic opportunities. And the second was because of the Ku Klux Klan in the South. And the third, and it's a true story and it's real, snakes, actual snakes. But that's our journey north in terms of my parents seeking better opportunity for our family and essentially fleeing from racism and oppression and trying to flee to opportunity. And so right now in our country, I see, obviously I've been talking a lot about this lately, and I see our nation divided into at least two camps. There are those who are cynical, who believe that this moment is just another moment like so many others, and that no real change can happen. And then there are those who are optimistic, and I count myself among them, and seeing this as a unique moment in our nation's history, and in fact, a unique moment in the world, with what we see with protests and the outrage. That 8 minutes and 46 seconds, it may be the most powerful 8 minutes and 46 seconds in my adult lifetime, in terms of the impact. And I believe something is different right now in those of us in all walks of life. Wherever we sit, wherever we stand, we need to lean in to this moment in a way that we haven't before. Many African Americans are tired, are exhausted, they're frustrated about this conversation. We've been telling you, and my message to those who have been on the front lines for a long time is now is not the time to retreat. Now is not the time to be frustrated and angry. Now is the time to lean in. And so I'm happy to have this conversation tonight. I'm happy to talk more about how I'm leaning in with respect to my call to action to corporate America. And I welcome your questions this evening. Thank you. You're on mute, David.
Pleasure. I started by building on a couple of the themes that you just highlighted. On many levels, this is a moment of despair for so many in our country. It seems as if little has changed in the fight against racism, in the fight for economic equality, the fight for criminal justice reform. And yet, in other ways, of course, this is a moment of opportunity, a word that you used a few minutes ago. And I think in a larger sense, that's why many of us are here on this call tonight. I'd be grateful if you could share a little bit more about, from your perspective, how we got here, and also what gives you hope in this moment in time.
Sure. And how we got here is basically 400 years of struggle for African Americans who were enslaved, and steps over periods of time, right? And one of the things which maybe we'll talk about later, 400 years sounds like a long time in America. One of the things that I appreciate from my time in Israel is that how we view time, right? And they say America, we're very short-sighted, and in Israel and Middle East, you speak in centuries all the time. And so these 400 years and making periodic, and as I write about, zigzags in history in terms of progress. And so we get to this place where so many people and there are different points in time, whether it's the end of legal slavery, whether it's the Voting Rights Act, whether it's the end of Jim Crow, or different elements. And to fast forward to modern times, whether it's the election of the first African-American president in Obama. And there's this notion and a lot of discussion about, America being post-racial, when the truth is, many of us African-American, we knew at the time that as much progress as that symbolized, that fundamentally we were not at a post-racial place. And we come to this conversation today, and this nation comes to this place today as a result of police violence against unarmed Blacks. We have Breonna Taylor, we have Ahmaud Arbery, we have George Taylor, but the examples are countless in this country, and there are examples in our state. And for a long time, what we're experiencing now, there's this level of disbelief among many Americans that we really had significant problems around this. But this has been happening, and so with the advent of video and the prevalence of that, and we've had that for a while, but there is something different about George Floyd's 8 minutes and 46 seconds that America has watched, and I call it perhaps our Emmett Till moment in modern times. And for those who don't know, Emmett Till went south to Mississippi, and he was lynched. He was a teenager, and his mother insisted that when he came back to Chicago and for the funeral service, insisted that it be open casket. And she wanted the world to see. She wanted the nation to see. And I think the nation seeing that and understanding it and listening to I Can't Breathe and calling for his deceased mother and having on watchers say, check his pulse. I think the culmination of that may bring us as a nation to a moment, like a collective aha moment. And that's where I think we are now. And the response, even to the call to action that I've received from CEOs, that gives me hope. You ask, why am I hopeful? Part of it is, as a person of faith, I come to every dark place with a sense of hope, or else it's over. As a community that has struggled to make progress, I come to it with hope. And, and certainly, I know you all can empathize with that notion of faith and being hopeful. But in addition to that, I come to this with hope based on the response that I see, the kind of empirical information. When we're watching our TV screens and you look at the difference of Ferguson, Missouri, several years ago in the protests and the demographics, the protest now is much more diverse in terms of who's there, right? Again, I talk about Emmett Till, and I talk about that moment, and I think about the civil rights movement, and I think about when the Freedom Riders, when it wasn't just African Americans riding on those buses, when more people got engaged, and it feels more akin to that moment than anything I've experienced in my lifetime. And so for all of those reasons, I'm hopeful. But even, just recently, you see public polling within the last 48 hours kind of coming out about these issues. And you see a marked change in American public opinion, whether it's the narrow question of police violence or police reform in that need, or the broader question about race in America and disparities. And ultimately, which I hope to talk about tonight, we have to get to that broader question as well in terms of the structural impediments to opportunity in this country.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thanks, Shawn. Following up on some of the things you've mentioned already, and really taking off on your Hartford Current op-ed with respect to how corporations can help make a difference here, and hopefully also how all those people on this call can help either inspire or pressure corporations to make a difference. What do you recommend? What are some examples that you've seen here in Connecticut or elsewhere around the country of corporations really showing respect, belonging, inclusion, both in the company, in their community? What do you, what can you hold up as an example for us?
So and I answer, I want to address that in two ways, right? In terms of the call to action, one, I want to just explain it if I could. The notion is that, we've been struggling with this problem for a very long time, and we need new vehicles and mechanisms to influence the outcourse and the trajectory of this moment that we're in, right? To lead towards success. And corporate America has a big influence on policy and life, and just through voice as well as through resources and so forth. And I've asked corporate America to get off the sidelines and to engage, right? And there's precedent for that with the economic boycott of South Africa and kind of the power that had towards contributing towards dismantling that racist regime. There's North Carolina more recently. And so that's my starting place with saying, corporate America, we do have examples where you've played a constructive role. Now is a moment for you to do so as well. In terms of the exact steps, and I should just note that in Parliament, there was one member of Parliament that consistently voted against apartheid legislation, and that was Helen Suzman, who was Jewish. And so when I talk about kind of our collective and shared kinship, it's not just in this country, but it's global in that sense. And so in terms of what can we do, what can corporations do specifically, one, with respect to police violence and the corporate voice, and I have had several conversations with CEOs recently engaging around this who want to be engaged. And that's an example of they don't have expertise in criminal justice issues, but they are beginning to recognize that they do have a voice, and normalizing the fact that we have a broken system that is killing unarmed Blacks and more, right? Because that's just the stuff that really gets the attention, but there's a deeper problem beyond that, as we all know. But giving voice to that collectively and putting pressure on legislators to actually take up legislation to combat these issues and to reform policing. So chokeholds, and there's a list in terms of that specifically. But broader than that, we have to get to the conversation of kind of the systemic problems in society that produce these gross disparities in economics, in education, in healthcare, in so many sectors. And that's the conversation that I am having with CEOs in terms of what they are willing to do with respect to these issues and lending their resources towards it. Additionally, the frame here is twofold. We all need to look in the mirror, right? We have to start with looking at ourselves as an individual. What can I do better? And I call them individuals. It's not good enough to just say not be racist, right? It's not good enough to be neutral. In fact, neutrality benefits the oppressor. And so neutrality is not enough, but we look in the mirror, what can we do? Corporate America, look in the mirror, what can you do within your organization? I've been engaged in leading an investor coalition, and we have ownership shares in corporations throughout the country or globe, and diversifying corporate boards. The number of corporate boards with all white men is unacceptable in my view, in this America. And there's data that supports the fact that diverse boards, Fortune 500 companies perform better because you have different perspectives. But that's a movement in terms of diversifying leadership, diversity and inclusion program. And we have, whether it's the Hartford, travelers doing things in these areas. But that's kind of in the mirror, creating pipeline programs with respect to training and opportunities for advancement. In addition to looking in the mirror, I think we have to look outside our windows as well. And we have to look and see, the communities in which we're in, in our states and across this nation, and what can we do to affirmatively contribute and combat these systemic issues.
Picking up off of what you described earlier briefly in terms of legislation, and again, consistent with the theme that much of America is awakening and mobilized to respond, we're seeing legislatures across the country as well, quickly scrambling to address, again, on a systemic legal basis, many of the issues that you've been talking about tonight. Lawmakers are considering a special session here in Connecticut. Among the challenges is how to navigate the state legislature in a COVID-19 environment, but they're working on that, and the governor is looking at that as well. And in significant measure to address criminal justice issues and issues of race and equity. You mentioned briefly a couple of examples, but be grateful if you could dive a little bit deeper. And again, as these initiatives are first being conceptualized and will probably materialize shortly in bills, what would you like to see specifically in Connecticut from our legislature, and how can the community help?
Sure. I would like to see greater police accountability measures. The reality is it is stark, the number of complaints and with no action as a result of those, and with no prosecutions in terms of the number of deaths of unarmed Blacks. And so there's a problem, and I don't want to get super technical here, but in terms of some of the laws and the way they're structured and the protection mechanisms. And, none of us, I believe, ever want a good cop doing their job in terms of protecting and serving to be unnecessarily punished. But I think it's inarguable that no one can think that a bad cop doing something wrong should be protected. And essentially, that's the way the system is set up right now. So policing policies need to be changed, right? Chokeholds. Eric Garner, was the, first very prominent case in New York where it was a chokehold, and he was saying, I can't breathe. So we didn't get the reform measures. Police culture. It is true that I don't know what the percentage is, but let's just call it, 98% of police are good, and the 2% maybe bad cops. Some of them never should have made it through the academy or the check. There are lots of things. So you have to root that out, but it is deeper. It is deeper than a few bad apples in terms of the culture, because once again, neutrality, right? And one might argue we know a little more about George Floyd's death now than we did in the initial videos. But the cop standing there who didn't intervene, right? And so this is another area when we think about the laws and creating an obligation, right? You take an oath to protect and to serve. It shouldn't be that you don't have that oath or that obligation if it's one of your fellow officers committing an offense. And some of that requires changing laws and the standards around policing. But the culture of policing needs to dramatically reform. And I have talked to, one of those ways, and the governor has talked about more diversity in the police force. That's absolutely necessary and important, and more members of the police force living in the communities in which they serve, right? Because again, it goes back to, perhaps Suzanne said it at the outset, notion of humanity. And in some of what we see, we see a lack of recognition of the humanity of the person that an officer is engaged with, because you can't see an individual's humanity and have your knee on their neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and over 2 minutes of which they haven't moved and have no pulse. You can't do that and see their humanity. So that's part of it. But yeah, I've talked to African-American officers when I was city council president in Hartford. I talked to African-American cops who essentially said, yeah, I get it in terms of the culture, but when I'm out there on a call and I need an officer to back me up, I can't have that officer thinking, well, he's not one of us, right? So there's a degree to which this is like blue in uniform and the rest of the world. And so it's the culture of policing that has to be dramatically reformed. In addition to policing and the police force, and I do believe that police force perhaps are doing too much and are required in society to do too much. So we have to look at kind of that scope of responsibilities. We have to look at training, but we also have to look at the system of prosecution, because it's out of whack, right? We have a social compact with our society, with our government, with our police force, is that we trust you to protect. You're charged with protecting and serving, and we trust you. But it's remarkably different for African Americans in terms of you grow up. I grow up as a young Black boy, not with the officer friendly. For those of you who remember that campaign, it's like, I don't know if the officer's friendly, right? I know if there's really a situation, I may have to rely upon the police, but it's a much more ambiguous coexistence with the police force. And so that has to change. And then at the prosecutorial level, there has to be accountability in the system, which will help move the policing itself to a fairer, more equitable system of policing.
Thanks, Shawn. That's really helpful. And I have my question's really a follow-up to that. So I think, I can't speak for everyone on the call, but I think if they're on this call, we all agree that change is required with respect to law enforcement. And many of the chiefs of police that we work with say the same things, right? And so at ADL, we work to make sure that hate crimes laws are enforced, and we track and monitor extremist groups. And we for very good reason, worry about those white supremacist groups getting violent and attacking houses of worship, Black churches, Jewish synagogues, right? It's how do we pressure for change and demand change in law enforcement and keep those strong relationships in law enforcement so that we can, because they are ultimately, at least until things radically change, if they ever do, they are that front line of public safety that are going to protect our houses of worship and religious institutions. How do we do that? And I guess as part of that, there's all these terms floating around: abolish the police, defund the police, reform the police. I think a lot of people have a lot of different definitions of those. How are you thinking about all that, and how we have this really delicate but needed conversation?
Yeah, so I think we have to take this head on, and honestly and openly, and we can no longer be put in the box of this false choice with policing. I have been a strong supporter personally of the police as it relates to making sure that they have the resources to do the job that we in public office ask them to do, protect and serve. But it can't be a false choice of either you're with us or against us. And I would say, and I'm very aware of the close working relationship with the ADL and the police, and federal law enforcement authorities, the necessity here. But if we're really all in this together, then it's not okay that we're okay, but my sister or my brother here is not, and we're watching this. So I think we have to collectively speak with one voice on this issue, because to date, we've been divided. And any criticism, it's like, oh, you're anti-law enforcement. No, I am pro-law enforcement. When I advocated for body cameras, I talked to police union and members, and I would tell them, this is going to get rid of all of the frivolous cases against your officers. This is good for the community, for us to see this. This is going to protect us all, right? But it's a false choice that's been created, and I think America is saying enough is enough, and it's just about what are we going to do about it. And what we're seeing, David, you asked earlier about me being hopeful. When I saw the swiftness with which police chiefs spoke out and called the Floyd killing what it was, that gave me hope. When I see police officers, as they did in front of the state capitol last week, everything's blurring together now. But when I see officers take a knee, and just a few years ago, there was this, in my view, a fabrication of Colin Kaepernick being disrespectful to the flag and unpatriotic for taking a knee. But when I see people get past that, and law enforcement officers, when I see Flint, Michigan, the police chief, and others go to the protests and say, we're with you. We're putting down our batons. You just tell us what you want us to do. When I see that, that's different. And that's where law enforcement needs to move. And in a very tragic, very disappointing situation, I recall former Hartford police chief, Jim Ravella, who's now the head of state police and public safety, and he and I were working very closely together on community policing and with faith-based institutions. In fact, we had a faith-based anti-violence initiative with faith leaders and police. But when I saw the efforts that he was making to close the gap, and there was a march on the police headquarters, and he decided to jump in like midway along the march and walk and talk with the protesters on their way to City Hall, to the police headquarters. And the treatment he received from the rank and file in the union about what he did, I said, that's wrong. The criticism he took for trying to de-escalate, trying to connect, and trying to have dialogue and saying, we're not the enemy. And it was that false choice that I'm talking about. And I told the officers, you can't make the police chief choose between the women and men that he leads and the people that he serves. And that's the false choice that we have to get away from, and to say, justice is justice, right is right, and that's what we're for. And if it costs us something in our relationship because we're honest and open, and we are asking you or demanding that you do right by all people, not just the ones you like better, then I think that's where we have to start and what we have to do. With respect to these various iterations, and I'm glad you asked it the way you did, because abolish the police departments, reform, defund, all of these things are conflated. You know, I can't tell you what everyone means when they talk about that, but what I can say is that I am for reforming policing in our country. They perform a vital role, and when policing is done right, that social compact is being honored between community and police, and it strengthens those ties, and everyone feels protected and served. And I've seen it, I've experienced it. You know, I've worked closely on a personal level with the police and prosecutors in bringing the killer of my cousin to justice, right? I know how hard they work and how committed, you know, many in law enforcement are, but I can recognize that and appreciate that and honor that service and still be critical of killing unarmed Blacks unjustifiably.
I'd like to remind our audience that in the Q&A box at the bottom, you can enter your questions. We'll be turning to audience questions in a moment. I want to pick up on one final question from us. Again, I think it speaks to hope and opportunity. And again, a theme that you've touched on in many ways as it relates to faith communities. If there was ever a time for different faith communities, different racial and ethnic communities to join together to combat bigotry and create a more inclusive society, this is it. The Jewish and the African-American communities have a long history of collaboration on the civil rights issues and in many other ways. What do you see today as the opportunities for effective coalition building, effective advocacy, effective education? In short, how do you think that specifically the Jewish and the African-American communities can be better allies together?
So great question. And, you know, there's a joke with some other, I wasn't really joking, but I said, you know, it's really time to get the band back together, because we've done great work together as communities, and some of that's based on a common sense of faith and our houses of worship, a common sense of justice, a common sense of service. And I think now in this moment, you know, and I obviously, some of you know, I've been a part of trying to build those coalitions with the African-American community and engaging and learning more. But I think we have to acknowledge that history, but I also am cognizant of the fact that in terms of present day, our communities need to understand each other better. We need to invest that time and I think rebuild, you know, that closeness, you know, that for my parents was born out of the civil rights movement and that kinship. But we need to do that again. You know, again, I'll make reference to, you know, considered myself a friend and an ally, you know, of the Jewish community, and everyone can't do this. But the time I spent in Israel, one of the things that was just so clear to me is no matter how hard you try, you will never understand. You can never understand the challenges without being there. The geography, the threats, it's so many layers and dimensions to that. And so I think we all have to do a better job of understanding, because that's where it starts, and modern day understanding of what this experience is like today, not just what it was like and what we overcame, but is like today for so many. We are in the midst of a pandemic, well, kind of two, but I'm speaking of the health one right now with COVID-19. And there's a lot of talk about we're all in this together. But when you see the numbers, you see the significant disparities. And, you know, people are starting to ask questions, but this is just the health disparities in the Black community, you know, higher rates of infection, higher hospitalization rates, higher rates of death, right? And all of these contributing factors, but why? And when you start to peel beneath the layers, you see the effects of disparities on so many levels. And so that's the work. We have modern day work to do to, just as we're still fighting, in fact, still fighting, there's a rise in anti-Semitism in our country. And that rise must be met with a rise in anti-Semitism activity and coalition building. And it's the same as it relates to this, what I refer to as America's original sin of slavery and continuing to fight that. But this is a moment for our communities to be closer, for all Americans to be closer. And I think that's what we want. But just so many people thought this was fixed. And so it's an awakening. And let's take this moment of awakening to build stronger ties with our communities.
Me, great.
Thanks. So I think we can take a few questions now. I've got a bunch in the Q&A here. First, we'll go to Pam Ehrenkrantz from Greenwich. What does it mean that the police are tasked with doing too much? What should we divest them of?
So what I mean by that is either so much of policing is the job is complicated, and we have police dealing with mental health issues without the resources within the police department to actually provide that support. So we have some version of a one-size-fits-all.
Shawn, I'm sorry to interrupt. Sounds like there's something funny with your mic. I don't know if anything happened.
How about this?
Okay. Let's just keep going. We'll see if it'll resolve.
Okay.
Okay. Go on. Go ahead.
Yeah. So
play through.
Okay. So we need more resources, right? In mental health support, we need more resources in domestic violence support. There are a lot of things that we need. And when you have people with a badge in the force of law and a deadly weapon that they carry around with them, or weapons, responding to the wide range and not having those additional resources, sometimes I think, we talk about training, and that's one way in terms of de-escalation tactics. But just recently, there was a death in Manchester, Connecticut, of a young, how is it? You're on mute, Steve.
You should try to mute and unmute so we can try to get rid of the interference we're having.
Is that better? No? I'm going to try to log back in. I can't hear you right now.
Hearing from your team that you should hang up and dial back in. Sorry. Let's try.
We'll try.
Everybody hang on. Treasurer's going to try to log back in. Well, let's give it a...
He likes to talk. Say something, Dave.
Yeah. David, maybe a duet?
Well, let's give it a moment. It should be fine.
And I'm sorry if we're definitely not going to be able to get to many of the questions, but I certainly can try to answer some of those. David and I can try to answer them ourselves, and we can also try to get them to Treasurer's team. They've been great to work with, and I know that they really want to have him have a chance to share his thoughts on all these things. So there are a series of questions.
Steve, we're back.
We're back. Okay.
How's this?
Oh, we got you. Great.
Much better.
Okay.
Got it?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So we were talking about police doing too much. We have, an example recently I was describing in Manchester, Connecticut, of a 27-year-old man who was killed at his home. And he had been in prison. He was on parole. He missed his check-in. and the police sent essentially a special regional task force SWAT team to the home. And there's a 27-year-old, parents there. He has a mind of a 15-year-old, and they're telling him there are no weapons in the house. We'll get him to come out. And he eventually, and he's talking crazy, and they end up killing him as he's coming out, giving himself up. It was painful. It was painful hearing this story. I read about it, but just this past weekend at a rally in Manchester, actually heard from his father describing this, and the contrast of, he was saying, in this pandemic, they say, stay safe, stay home. He said he was home, and it wasn't safe to be there. But so that's just an example of where some mental health support with that situation would have been helpful. So when I say policing, perhaps they're doing too much. Is a concept of over policing and over criminalization. In the Hartford Public Schools, we successfully fought to remove police officers from the schools. In many communities in the country, they have school resource officers. They have folks who didn't go through police academy, don't carry a gun to deal with disturbances of students or truancy or things like that. In the Hartford school system, they used to have the Hartford Police Department. And so what you end up with is what in another community would be just a disagreement, an issue. You end up with a police solution with a teenager and starting the records and the criminalization process rather than the dealing with an adolescent and mentoring, coaching, and whatever resources. And so those are just like two examples of where we perhaps ask the police to do too much in that regard. And we need to look at the focus of what policing is, in addition to kind of changing the culture of policing.
I'd like to shift to another sort of very concrete issue, pun intended. You'll see as I go further in the question. I had shared with Steve that in going through some historical archives of ADL a number of years ago for an anniversary, I came across work that ADL had done in the 1960s, particularly in Fairfield County, I believe it was Greenwich, to try to take on the issue of multi-acre zoning, which many argued at that time was in part designed to keep minorities out of Greenwich and Fairfield County. And so Eric Zaks writes, Eric Zaks from West Hartford writes, there's a significant issue of housing segregation between Hartford and the surrounding suburbs, including West Hartford. Today, in this context, what are the concrete steps that we can take to address this aspect of structural racism?
Sure, and thank you, Eric, for the question. This is a significant issue, and we have to engage and lobby local leaders in office to change zoning, to make this more permissible. This often comes up, and I would see it where as a city, you can get resources from the state for affordable housing to locate it in the city, right? But you try to do that, right? Either you're confronted with local zoning restrictions or issues with building an affordable housing in a predominantly white suburban middle class area, or you have legislators from those areas who say we don't want that funding. And the way it works at the state is, state funding gets directed by the governor and legislators who lobby for certain types of funding in their communities. But that is something that we have to tackle. It's limiting freedom. It's limiting opportunity. It's limiting free association. And what that does, not only is it harmful for the individual who's restricted because of their economic status, but it's, for cities, quite frankly, like Bridgeport and Hartford, New Haven, you force higher concentrations of poverty. And there's data, significant data, on the correlations between higher concentrations of poverty and the nature of the school systems. And, the list goes on, right? So reducing the concentration of poverty, increasing kind of economic opportunities, right? And that's why, when we talk about this opportunity we have now and this window coming into it, starting with a conversation around police violence, but saying if we really want to move this country, we have to get to housing. We have to get to economics. We have to get to these other categories and health disparities.
Thank you.
So thank you. So I think we've got time for one more question, and it was going to be the question I was going to ask, but so many people in the Q&A asked it that I'll just sort of sum up their questions, which is, as many of us on the call are members of the Jewish community, many of the people on the call are white, some are not. But one of the big questions that a lot of people are asking is, whether it's the Jewish community or the white community here in Connecticut, what can we do? What 2, 3, 4 things as we go off tomorrow, next week, next month? What can we do to be part of really the dismantling of structural racism and the unifying of America that becomes the land and country we all want it to be? So.
Thank you. That is a terrific last question. And I would say first, going back to my mirror analogy, and that's part of what this question is, right? Saying, what can we do? So to start with being educated, and most folks on this, you're here, right? So this is like, as we say in the Black church, preaching to the choir. You're here because of that, but that education and understanding aspect has to go beyond you to your circles and spheres of influence. And that may be if you're a member of a club, that may venture there, that may be your workspace, but this being actively anti-racist and deciding neutrality is not good enough. And so I would say step 1. 2, doing something to impact others with respect to that viewpoint. And 3, engaging and beyond this moment. What the cynics among us will say is that this is just now. And when the protests die down, when things settle down and our country gets back to normal, this will all go away. Help me prove them wrong. Don't stop the conversation. Don't stop the education, and don't stop the work in the different ways that you're involved. One way that people have been involved, whether corporations or others, is through supporting initiatives financially around social justice, criminal justice reform, might be housing, whether it's a Fair Housing Coalition or their ways. But this is about, in order to really confront this is going to require time, talent, and treasure. And looking at it that way broadly and being prepared to engage in the long haul. And I'll tell you, with respect to the corporations that I'm talking to, it is my hope, and I'll just throw out some time frames, that within the next 10 months, we will have made significant progress in state legislatures, local municipalities, and at the federal level with advancing police reform initiatives and efforts. and that we will do that. But the work of addressing education disparities, healthcare disparities, economic disparities, that's at least a project for the next decade. And being committed to it, and I'm asking them to engage in a modern day version of a Marshall Plan with resources, both financial and intellectual, around these challenges and partnering with others for this work. And so individually, again, this is not one size fits all, because we do different things. Some of us are faith leaders, right? And the power of being a faith leader in terms of shaping public opinion, right? Those of us in office, we only get to do the work and do really good work when public opinion creates the space for us to do that. And that's why the peaceful protests are powerful for us, and other things that elevate this conversation and move to the mainstream the necessity to confront systemic and structural racism in our society and no longer make that a fringe issue.
Thank you so much, Treasurer Wooden, for all your insights and your thoughtful leadership and inspirational words. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. David and Steve, thank you very much for all you've done to put this together, and to the staffs of ADL and the Jewish Federation and Treasurer Wooden's staff. You guys were amazing to get this all together so quickly. So thank you everyone for coming. Go out and continue
Suzanne,
fighting the
Thanks
good
to
fight.
all of our co-sponsors from around the whole state.
Yes,
Thank you very much for promoting this. And I'm going to say something I wasn't supposed to say. I think if you're open to it, we'd love to do some deeper dives on some of these questions. There's so many things people had to ask. So we'll get in touch with your team. So
yes, I'm open to it, and I just want to close where I began with just saying, thank you, and you. This is all of you participating in this Zoom meeting this evening. It's only through greater dialogue. It starts there, right? It doesn't end there, but it's got to start there. And I just want to say I'm really grateful for your presence here tonight, and for our long relationship in terms of what your community has meant to my community over a long period of time. Thank you.
Thank you.